The Alpha King pretended to be disabled to test his pack, then an Omega shared her house and food. The rain arrived without warning, which Jonah Greymark found appropriate, given that he had spent 3 months planning this particular brand of disappearance. Thunder rolled across the northern ridge of his territory as he guided his vehicle toward the cliff edge with the same calculated precision he applied to every decision that carried the weight of 5 territories, 200,000 lives, and a throne he had inherited at 19 after finding his parents' bodies cooling in their own blood. The storm suited his purposes, obscured the deliberate nature of what might otherwise appear accidental, and as the wheels left solid ground, as gravity claimed what he willingly surrendered, Jonah felt something close to relief, which disturbed him more than the impact that followed. The vehicle rolled 3 times before settling against an ancient oak, metal shrieking, glass fragmenting into constellation patterns across wet earth. Jonah tasted copper, felt ribs crack in ways that would heal within hours, and reached inward for the core of his power, that molten thread of alpha authority that connected him to every wolf in his domain, and he smothered it. The suppression magic fought him, resisted like a living thing that knew suffocation, but he had practiced this for weeks in the privacy of his chambers, and he forced it down, until the golden aura that marked him as king diminished to the barely perceptible warmth of any common alpha. Then he went deeper, twisting the magic in ways that ancient texts warned against, and he felt his spine go numb, his legs become distant countries he no longer governed. The paralysis was temporary, reversible, and utterly convincing. He had informed his inner council, including Victor Talridge, his beta and most trusted advisor, that he would spend 3 weeks on covert territorial inspection, assessment of border security, evaluation of pack integration in the outer regions. Victor had smiled his politician's smile, all careful teeth and calculated warmth, and agreed this showed admirable dedication. Jonah had watched that smile and remembered intercepted communications, financial discrepancies that appeared and vanished like ghosts in his accounting records, whispered reports from loyal gammas about beta-rank wolves meeting in locations they believed unmonitored. He had learned, in the 12 years since inheriting his crown, that trust was a luxury kings could not afford, and suspicion was the price of survival. Now he waited, slumped against deployed airbags, rain hammering the ruined vehicle, for whatever would come next. What came was an Omega who smelled of fryer grease, exhaustion, and something beneath that, something like wild sage and copper, who appeared through the downpour with a flashlight that cut geometric shapes through darkness. Jonah watched her approach through half-closed eyes, cataloged details with the trained observation of someone who had spent a decade learning to read threats in the angle of a shoulder, the cadence of breathing. She was small, perhaps 5 feet and 2 inches, with copper-red hair plastered to her skull, skin so pale the freckles across her nose looked like paint spatters, and she moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. She reached the vehicle, wedged open the door with strength that surprised him, though it shouldn't have. Omegas were not weak, despite what traditional hierarchies claimed, merely lowest in a structure that valued dominance over endurance. Her eyes, green-gray like river stones, swept across him with assessment that felt clinical, detached, and she spoke with a voice that carried the flat vowels of pack outskirts, places where accents remained untouched by the polished speech patterns of central territories. "Can you move?" she asked, and Jonah let his head loll, played the part of someone hovering at consciousness's edge. "Legs," he managed, thickening his speech with manufactured trauma. Can't feel them." Something shifted in her expression, not quite sympathy, more like resigned recognition, the look of someone encountering another expected disaster in a life apparently full of them. She leaned closer, checked his pupils with the flashlight, tested his spine with surprisingly knowledgeable fingers, and he wondered what education an Omega from the territorial outskirts might possess, what circumstances had taught her emergency medical assessment. "I'm taking you to my place," she said, decisive in ways that suggested she had considered and rejected alternatives. "Pack Hospital asks questions first, treats second, and you don't look like you have time for their paperwork." This interested him, this immediate distrust of official pack structures, and Jonah filed it away with all the other observations he was collecting, pieces of a puzzle he had come here to solve. She helped him from the wreckage with difficulty, his dead weight requiring multiple attempts, and he could have assisted, could have used the alpha strength that remained in his upper body, but he committed fully to his helplessness, let her struggle, watched how she adapted her approach with each failure until she found leverage points that worked. The walk to her residence took 40 minutes, most of which Jonah spent draped across her shoulders in a fireman's carry that must have been agony for someone her size, though she never complained, merely adjusted her grip when necessary and kept moving through rain that had graduated from downpour to deluge. By the time they reached the small cottage set back from a larger farmhouse, both were shaking with cold, and Jonah's manufactured paralysis had become complicated by actual hypothermia. She deposited him on a threadbare couch that dominated the front room of what appeared to be a two-room dwelling, walls thin enough that he could hear rain drumming individual shingles, floor uneven in ways that spoke of foundation settling and deferred maintenance. The space smelled of poverty, not the dramatic destitution of absolute deprivation, but the grinding subsistence of someone who had enough to survive, and nothing extra, ever, for comfort or emergency or the simple pleasure of abundance. She built a fire in a wood stove that looked older than she was, stripped his wet clothes with impersonal efficiency that suggested either medical training or simple pragmatism overriding modesty concerns, and wrapped him in blankets that were worn soft with age and washing. Then she disappeared into what he assumed was a bedroom, returned in dry clothes, her hair twisted into a braid that revealed the sharp angles of her face, the old scar along her left jaw, the particular thinness of someone who frequently chose between adequate meals and other necessities. "I'm Wren," she offered, moving to the kitchen area that occupied one corner of the room, separated from living space by intention rather than architecture. "Wren Coulter. You have a name, or should I just call you Idiot Who Drives in Storm Conditions?" Jonah felt his mouth twitch despite himself. "J," he said, offering the abbreviation he had decided upon. "Just J." She glanced back, skepticism clear in the angle of her eyebrows. "Nobody's named Just J, but I figure you've got reasons for privacy, and I'm not interested in complications." She pulled ingredients from a cabinet that looked mostly empty, began assembling soup with movements that spoke of long practice and limited resources. Jonah watched her stretch what should have fed one person into portions for two, watched her measure and recalculate, sacrifice her own adequacy for shared inadequacy, and something in his chest tightened in ways that had nothing to do with his cracked ribs. They ate in silence, Wren sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the couch, bowl cradled in hands that bore scars of labor, burns from cooking work, cuts from unspecified sources. The soup was thin but surprisingly flavorful, and Jonah ate slowly, partly from feigned weakness, partly from genuine appreciation for food offered by someone who had very little to offer. "You'll stay until you're stable," Wren said finally. Not quite a question. "Then you leave, and we forget this happened. I don't need pack authorities asking why I'm harboring unregistered wolves." "Unregistered?" Jonah echoed, filing away this terminology. "You're not from Greymark Pack," she said with certainty. "I'd smell the territory bond, which means you're either rogue or visiting, and either way you're supposed to register within 24 hours of entry. Since you're here instead of at Packhouse, I'm guessing registration wasn't your priority." She was wrong. He was absolutely Greymark Pack, the center and source of every bond that connected these lands, but his suppression magic had hidden that truth effectively. Her assumption told him something useful about how thoroughly she existed outside official pack structures, how little contact she had with central authority. "Why help me then?" he asked, genuine curiosity in the question. Wren was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice carried something too flat to be bitterness, too tired to be anger. "Because nobody helped me when I needed it," she said simply, "and I remember what that felt like." She collected the bowls, washed them in a sink that relied on a hand pump, and Jonah watched her move through domestic routines in a space so small she could cross it in 8 steps. This Omega who existed invisible to pack power structures, who offered food she could not spare to a stranger who she believed might bring her trouble. Later, when she had made him a pallet on the floor beside the couch, when she had collapsed in her own bed in the adjacent room with the sudden completeness of someone whose exhaustion permitted no gradual descent into sleep, Jonah lay awake and stared at ceiling beams that needed repair, and wondered what he was actually testing, and what he might discover that he had not prepared himself to find. Outside, the storm continued, and somewhere in the Pack's central territories, Victor Talridge was likely beginning to wonder why his Alpha King had not checked in, why the expected communications had gone silent, and whether opportunity might be approaching on quiet feet. The weight of hidden crowns. 5 days passed with the peculiar elasticity of time measured in discomfort and observation, and Jonah learned the architecture of Wren's life through details she did not deliberately share. She woke before dawn each morning, moving through the cottage with practiced silence, though he always heard her. His alpha senses remained sharp even if his aura stayed buried. She worked 3 jobs, he discovered, piecing together her schedule from fragments of overheard conversations and the rotation of uniforms she wore. Mornings at a diner called Hartley's, where she cooked breakfast for early shift factory workers, afternoons cleaning the community center on the edge of pack territory, weekends selling produce at the farmer's market from vegetables she grew in the small plot behind the cottage. She returned each evening progressively more depleted, and Jonah watched exhaustion accumulate in her body like sediment, the way her hands shook slightly when she prepared their shared meals, how she sometimes fell asleep sitting upright at the small table, fork halfway to his mouth. She never complained, never acknowledged the unsustainability of her existence, and he found this more disturbing than if she had raged against circumstances, because her acceptance spoke of expectations ground down to bare survival. On the 3rd day, the landlady appeared, a compact woman in her late 60s with steel-gray hair wound in a bun tight enough to suggest military discipline, and warm brown eyes that saw considerably more than her pleasant expression indicated. She arrived without knocking, opened the cottage door with the confidence of property ownership, and stopped short when she saw Jonah arranged on the couch with blankets pulled around his waist, his useless legs extended before him. "Nell Cartwright," she introduced.
Heard herself, studying him with assessment that felt surgical. "I own this property and the main house. You're the wreck from the storm." It was not a question, and Jonah inclined his head in acknowledgement, keeping his expression carefully neutral, projecting helplessness and minimal threat. "He's leaving once he's stable," Wren said quickly, defensiveness sharpening her voice. "I know the housing agreement says no additional occupants, but he can't exactly walk to Pack Hospital, and I'm not letting him die because of paperwork." Nell's gaze moved between them, calculating something Jonah could not quite identify, and then she smiled with surprising warmth. "I wasn't going to object, child. Just wanted to make sure you weren't being taken advantage of." This last directed at Jonah with pointed emphasis. "She's been remarkably generous," Jonah said carefully, meaning it more than she could know. The older woman softened fractionally, nodded once, and left with instructions for Wren to come by the main house for vegetables from her greenhouse. She had extra, which Jonah suspected was a lie designed to supplement Wren's inadequate resources without injuring her pride. After she departed, Wren sagged slightly, tension draining from her shoulders. "Nell raised me after my parents died," she said quietly, staring at the closed door. "She's the only person in this pack who ever treated me like I mattered." This felt like significant information, delivered without fanfare, and Jonah filed it alongside everything else he was learning about pack structure, from its margins. "How old were you?" he asked. 12. Wren moved to the kitchen, began preparing something that smelled of onions and optimism. "Territory dispute went wrong. My parents were Gammas, warriors. They died protecting the northern border from rogues. Pack blamed me for distracting them, said they were worried about getting home to their daughter instead of focusing on the fight. After that, I was the Omega whose existence killed 2 good wolves." She delivered this history with the same flat affect she applied to everything painful, emotions compressed until they became simple facts, and Jonah felt rage kindle in his chest, carefully controlled fire that could not show on his face. Pack law was clear. Children were never blamed for parental death in service, and the fact that this principle had been violated spoke to rot in his command structure deeper than he had suspected. "That's not how combat works," he said, keeping his voice level. "Warriors die because enemies kill them, not because they have families." Wren glanced back, something flickering in her expression that might have been gratitude, or might have been suspicion of false comfort. "You talk like you know about fighting." He had made an error, revealed too much familiarity with military thinking, and Jonah course-corrected smoothly. "I've done security work. You learn how combat functions when your job is preventing it." She accepted this, or pretended to, and returned her attention to cooking. They ate together as had become their pattern, and Jonah asked careful questions about pack leadership, framing them as outsider curiosity, innocent inquiry from someone unconnected to local power structures. "I've never met the Alpha King," Wren admitted when he asked about Jonah directly. "Low-rank wolves don't get invited to pack gatherings. I've seen his beta, though, Victor Talridge. He came through the market once, inspecting vendor permits." She paused, something dark crossing her face. "He was there the night my parents died. I remember him standing with the other high ranks while they decided I was responsible. He didn't argue for me." Jonah absorbed this information with mounting unease, another piece of pattern he did not want to recognize. "What do you think of the Alpha King?" he asked, needing to know how his failures appeared from outside his insulated perspective. Wren considered the question with visible care, weighing words before releasing them. "I think he's probably too far removed to know what happens at pack edges." "I think hierarchy is necessary. Structure keeps us safe from external threats, but I think the people implementing his authority are more interested in power than protection." She met his eyes directly. "I believe in strong leadership. I just don't think we have it, not really, not where it matters." This answer troubled him more than outright condemnation would have, because she was correct. He had been too removed,
too focused on territorial politics and interpack diplomacy to notice how his own beta was wielding authority in his name. The realization sat in his stomach like swallowed stones. On the 5th day, an envelope arrived, slipped under the cottage door while Wren was at her diner shift, and Jonah was alone with his observations and growing concern. He retrieved it using upper body strength, pulled himself across the floor with his arms, maintaining his paralysis even in solitude. Discipline demanded consistency. The envelope bore official Pack Housing Authority letterhead, and inside, formal language announced that Wren Coulter's residence had been designated for priority redevelopment. She had 30 days to vacate. Assistance with relocation would not be provided, as her housing subsidy had been revoked due to insufficient Pack contribution scores. Jonah read the document 3 times, rage building with each pass, because this was bureaucratic cruelty disguised as administrative efficiency, and the signature at the bottom belonged to Victor's chief administrative assistant. When Wren returned that evening, he watched her open the envelope, saw her face close down as she read, witnessed the moment hope died behind her eyes, and she simply folded the paper, placed it on the table, and began preparing dinner as though her world had not just contracted further. "Wren," he said carefully. "It's fine." Her voice carried no conviction. "I'll figure something out. I always do." But she did not meet his eyes, and her hands trembled more than usual as she worked, and when she served their meal, he noticed her portion was smaller than his, despite her needing calories he did not, and Jonah felt something crack in his chest, some assumption about necessary distance between king and subject, some comfortable lie about acceptable casualties in larger strategic thinking. Later, after she had fallen into exhausted sleep, Jonah lay awake and stared at the ceiling beams he had memorized over 5 days, and wondered what he had actually been testing. He had come to identify traitors, to root out conspiracy, to determine who could be trusted with power. Instead, he was discovering how power itself corrupted when divorced from accountability, how his absence enabled cruelty, how the Omega who had shared her inadequate resources with a stranger was being systematically erased by the structure he had sworn to protect. Somewhere in the Central Territories, Victor was moving pieces on a board Jonah had not fully understood he was playing on. The 3-week deadline for his return had not yet passed, but 9 days without contact was enough to make ambitious betas consider possibilities, test boundaries, begin the slow work of transitioning from trusted advisor to essential replacement. Jonah reached inward for his suppressed power, felt it coiled and waiting, golden authority that could solve Wren's housing crisis with a single command. But revealing himself now would abort his investigation, would alert Victor before Jonah understood the full scope of conspiracy. And kings did not act on incomplete information. Kings sacrificed pawns for strategic advantage. Except Wren was not a pawn. She was a person who had shown him more genuine humanity in 5 days than his inner circle had demonstrated in 12 years. And if protecting her meant compromising his investigation, then perhaps his investigation was designed wrong. He had no easy answers, only growing conviction that he had structured his test incorrectly, that he had come looking for traitors in his ranks, and found instead his own failure reflected in the eyes of an Omega who believed leaders did not
care because his inattention had proven her correct. Fractures in the foundation. 2 weeks had passed since Jonah's manufactured accident, and the 3-week deadline he had established for his covert mission expired on a Tuesday morning, marked by unseasonable cold and the kind of political maneuvering that required his absence to flourish. He learned of the Pack assembly through Wren, who received a mandatory attendance notice delivered by a young Gamma who looked at her cottage with barely disguised contempt, as though poverty might be contagious and low rank a moral failing rather than arbitrary designation. The assembly was scheduled for evening, and Wren moved through her day with tension that manifested in shortened breath and compulsive checking of the notice, rereading words that did not change with repetition. Jonah watched her prepare with care that spoke of someone who understood appearance as survival strategy. She braided her copper hair with precision, wore her least damaged clothing, carried herself with deliberate neutrality designed to avoid notice. She left him with water and bread within reach, apologized for the inadequacy, though she had nothing to apologize for, and departed into desk with shoulders set like someone approaching execution rather than civic gathering. Jonah waited until her footsteps faded, then pulled himself to the window, positioned himself to see the path leading toward Pack Center. What he did next violated every principle of his self-imposed test, but 2 weeks of observation had rearranged his priorities in ways he had not anticipated. He reached for the small communication device hidden in his jacket, rescued from the wrecked vehicle that first night and concealed since, and activated the encrypted channel that connected him to exactly one person. Finn Bosworth answered on the second pulse.
About damn time. I was starting to think you'd actually paralyzed yourself with that suppression magic. I need visual on the pack assembly, Jonah said without preamble. Live feed if possible. Silence stretched long enough that Jonah wondered if the connection had failed. Then Finn's voice returned, careful and concerned. You're supposed to be maintaining cover. Watching the assembly risks emotional compromise. The situation has evolved, Jonah said, which was accurate if incomplete. Victor's making moves earlier than projected. I need to see what he's announcing. Another pause, then resignation. Give me 20 minutes to position cameras. And Jonah, whatever you see, remember you can't intervene without blowing the entire operation. The connection severed, and Jonah pulled himself back to the couch, arranged his useless legs, and waited with the particular patience he had cultivated over 12 years of kingship, the ability to remain still while chaos approached. 19 minutes later, his phone illuminated with incoming video stream, and he watched his pack gather in the central square, with Victor Towridge positioned on the raised platform traditionally reserved for the Alpha King. His beta wore formal ceremonial attire, deep gray and silver that evoked authority without quite claiming royal prerogative, and his salt and pepper hair was styled with careful attention that suggested this appearance had been planned, rehearsed, calculated for maximum impact. The assembled pack numbered perhaps 300. Mandatory attendance ensured representation from all ranks, and Jonah scanned faces with craned observation, catalogued who stood close to the platform in positions of support, who maintained distance, who watched with skepticism or fear or anticipation. He found Wren near the back, partially obscured by taller wolves, her face a careful blank that he had learned meant she was experiencing strong emotion she could not afford to display. She stood isolated even in the crowd, other pack members maintaining subtle distance as though her low rank created exclusion zone, and Jonah felt his hands curl into fists before he consciously relaxed them. Victor called the assembly to order with voice that carried.
Reed practiced authority and began speaking with the measured cadence of someone delivering prepared remarks designed to sound spontaneous. He spoke of uncertainty, of the Alpha King's unprecedented silence during what should have been routine territorial inspection, of growing concerns for Jonah's safety given the dangerous nature of border regions and the persistent threat of rogue activity. He expressed these concerns with performance of worry that might have convinced Jonah himself if he had not spent 2 weeks learning what genuine concern looked like through Wren's exhausted care. The laws of succession are clear, Victor continued, his cold blue eyes sweeping across the assembled pack. Should our Alpha King be confirmed dead or permanently incapacitated, leadership transfers to the Beta until challenge can be formally issued and resolved. I do not wish to assume this burden prematurely. A pause, perfectly timed. But I will not allow our pack to drift leaderless while we cling to hope that may be false comfort. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, agreement and concern blending into indistinct sound, and Jonah watched his Beta manipulate collective anxiety with surgical precision. This was the opening move of coup, disguised as reluctant duty, Victor positioning himself as responsible steward rather than ambitious usurper, and the genius of it lay in its patience. He was not claiming the throne, merely warming it, creating infrastructure of leadership that would become difficult to dismantle once established. Then Victor moved to new business, and Jonah felt his spine stiffen despite its manufactured paralysis. New regulations, Victor announced, designed to optimize pack efficiency and resource allocation during this period of uncertainty. All Omegas would be required to register for Household Placement Program, their labor redirected from independent employment to service in higher-ranking homes, where their contributions could be properly structured and supervised. This would provide them with stable housing and adequate nutrition, while freeing up independent residences for more productive pack members. The language was bureaucratic, sanitized, and described systematic enslavement with vocabulary of social improvement. Jonah saw Wren's face lose all color, watched her sway slightly as though the words had physical weight, and he reached for his power instinctively before forcing control, suppressing the golden rage that wanted to explode outward and unmake everything Victor had just proposed. Registration will be mandatory within 7 days, Victor continued. Failure to comply will result in classification as Rogue Omega, subject to immediate detention and forced placement. We do this not as punishment, but as protection, ensuring our most vulnerable members receive appropriate care. The crowd's murmurs shifted towards acceptance, some nodding with approval, buying the fiction that removal of autonomy constituted care, and Jonah saw how easily people accept cruelty when packaged as benevolence. But he also saw resistance, small clusters of wolves exchanging glances that suggested skepticism, lower ranks who understood they were watching preview of their own eventual subjugation, because tyranny never stopped with its first victims. The assembly concluded with Victor's reminder that all pack members should report any information regarding the Alpha King's whereabouts, substantial reward offered, loyalty to pack superseded personal relationships. Then the crowd dispersed, fragmenting into smaller groups, some animated with discussion, others silent with concern, and Jonah watched Wren walk alone back towards the cottage, her stride mechanical, shock transforming her into something automated. She returned to find him positioned exactly as she had left him, and for a long minute she simply stood inside the closed door, staring at nothing, processing everything. When she finally spoke, her voice emerged flat and distant, disassociated from the words it produced. They're going to take everything. The cottage, the jobs, the illusion that I
have any control over my own existence. She moved to the table, sat heavily. 7 days until I'm classified as property. Jonah wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to reveal that he was the Alpha King and could unmake Victor's proclamation with single command, wanted to promise protection and justice and all the things kings were supposed to provide. But revealing himself now meant abandoning the investigation before understanding the full conspiracy, meant Victor would scatter his co-conspirators and evidence, meant future coups would simply become more careful rather than prevented. So instead he said, there are old pack laws, predating current administrative code, property rights that supersede housing authority jurisdiction. If Nell's land is privately held rather than pack allocated, the eviction notice has no legal foundation. Wren's head lifted, something flickering behind her shock. How do you know pack law? He had revealed too much again, allowed his expertise to show through his constructed identity, and Jonah met her eyes directly, made a calculated decision. I told you I did security work. That includes knowing the legal structures I was protecting. Your housing notice cited pack contribution scores, but if you're on private land, those metrics don't apply. Challenge the eviction through Elder Council review. She studied him with new intensity, intelligence sharp behind her exhaustion. You know too much for simple security work, and you've been giving tactical advice for 2 weeks like someone trained in command structure. Her voice dropped. Who are you, really? Before Jonah could construct response, footsteps approached the cottage, heavy and multiple, and Wren's expression shifted from suspicion to fear. The door opened without courtesy of knocking, and 3 wolves entered with the confidence of sanctioned authority, all wearing Enforcement Division insignia, all carrying themselves with casual threat that came from power without accountability. The leader, a thick-shouldered beta named Carson, who Jonah recognized from disciplinary reports he had reviewed months ago, smiled at Wren with expression that contained no warmth. Wren Coulter, we're here to expedite your household transition. Pack leadership has identified this property for immediate reassignment. The eviction notice gave me 30 days, Wren said, standing slowly, positioning herself between the enforcers and Jonah with instinct at suggested protection despite her disadvantage. Timeline has been accelerated given current circumstances. Carson's gaze moved to Jonah. You're harboring an unregistered wolf. That's additional violation, compounds your non-compliant status. Jonah remained motionless on the couch, playing his paralyzed role while calculating angles and advantages. 3 opponents, enclosed space, his upper body still functional even if he had to maintain appearance of useless legs. Wren's hands curled into fists, and he saw the moment her fear transformed into something sharper, more dangerous. Get out, she said quietly. Carson laughed, and his companions moved to flank him, beginning systematic destruction of the cottage's meager contents, toppling shelves, scattering Wren's careful organization, performance of dominance disguised as property search. When one enforcer reached for the box containing her parents' ashes, kept on the high shelf she dusted weekly, Wren moved. The shift was partial, claws extending, canines lengthening, her eyes bleeding to amber as her wolf rose close enough to surface to grant enhanced strength, and she hit the enforcer with focused violence that sent him stumbling backward into the wall. For 3 seconds she was magnificent, feral grace and justified rage, and then the other 2 were on her, and Jonah watched her fight with everything she possessed, which was considerable but ultimately insufficient against 2 trained warriors who outweighed her by 100 pounds each. They forced her down, restrained her arms, and Carson produced silver-threaded restraints that would burn Omega skin, suppress her ability to shift, render her helpless in ways that went beyond physical. Jonah's control wavered, his suppressed aura flickering, gold bleeding into the air before he crushed it down, because revealing himself meant Victor would know, would disappear evidence, would transform his conspiracy into something Jonah could never fully exiles. But watching Wren's blood on the floor, hearing her small sound of pain as silver touched her wrists, Jonah discovered the limits of his strategic patience. Then Nell's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding despite her age. Remove your hands from her. This is private property, and you have no warrant. She stood in the doorway with legal document held high, deed to her land, and her warm brown eyes had gone hard as flint. The enforcers hesitated, uncertain, And in that moment of confusion, Nell continued, "This cottage sits on land I purchased 40 years ago, before current housing regulations existed. Pack authority ends at my property line, and you're trespassing." Carson's face darkened, but he released Wren, gestured for his companions to withdraw. "This isn't finished. Compliance will be ensured." They departed, leaving destruction in their wake, and Wren collapsed against the overturned table, shaking with reaction. Nell moved to her immediately, checking injuries with practiced hands, and Jonah remained frozen on his couch, useless and furious, and increasingly certain he had structured his entire investigation around the wrong questions. He had come to identify traitors. Instead, he was learning how his absence enabled atrocity, how his strategic patience purchased nothing except suffering for people he had sworn to protect, how sitting in judgment of others' loyalty meant nothing if his own failure to lead created the conditions for betrayal to flourish. Outside, darkness settled over the Packlands, and somewhere in Central Territories, Victor Tallridge was consolidating power while the Alpha King lay paralyzed on an Omega's couch and watched his kingdom crumble from its foundations upward. The unraveling disguise. The night after the Enforcer's invasion stretched into something neither sleep nor wakefulness, existing in suspended space where Wren sat at the righted table with silver burns across her wrists, and Jonah remained on the couch, watching shadows move across walls that had witnessed her humiliation. Nell had stayed until midnight, applying salve to injuries and speaking quietly about legal challenges and elder council procedures, but they all understood bureaucracy moved slowly, while Victor's malice operated with efficiency, and eventually the older woman had returned to her farmhouse with instructions to call if circumstances deteriorated further. Now, at 3 a.m, Wren finally broke the silence that had calcified between them. "You were going to help me. When they had me restrained, I saw you shift position. Your legs moved." Jonah had known this confrontation approached with inevitability, had prepared responses during the long hours of dark, but preparation felt inadequate against her direct accusation. He met her eyes across the small room and made a decision that felt simultaneously necessary and catastrophic. The paralysis was never real, he admitted, letting truth fracture his carefully maintained fiction. "I'm sorry." Her face remained carefully neutral, but her hands tightened on the table edge. "Why?" "I am investigating pack corruption," Jonah said, selecting words with precision, revealing partial truth because complete honesty remained impossible. "I work for the Alpha King's intelligence network. The disability was cover, allowed me to observe how pack members behave when they believe no authority is watching." This was close enough to accurate that it tasted less like lie than simplification, though the distinction felt philosophical at best. Wren absorbed the information with visible processing, intelligence working behind exhaustion and pain. "So I was part of your investigation. My kindness was data point in whatever report you're compiling." Her voice
Ice carried no inflection, which somehow hurt worse than anger would have. Initially, Jonah acknowledged, because denying it would constitute crueler deception. But that changed. You became someone I couldn't reduce to assessment criteria. She stood abruptly, moved to the window, stared out at darkness that revealed nothing. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then stand up. Show me who you actually are." Jonah shifted upright, released the suppression magic that had maintained his manufactured paralysis for 2 weeks, and felt sensation flood back into his legs with pins and needles discomfort that was entirely real despite the false cause. He stood slowly, unfolding to his full height of 6 feet and 5 inches, and watched Wren's reflection in the window glass as she registered the physical presence he had kept carefully diminished, the alpha strength that was apparent in his frame even with the aura he still kept buried. "You're not just intelligence network," she said quietly. "You move like warrior, speak like tactician, and know pack law better than most council members. What rank are you really?" "Alpha," Jonah said, which was accurate if catastrophically incomplete. "I hide my aura to avoid detection, but yes, I'm Alpha rank." She turned to face him fully, and something in her expression suggested she suspected further deception but lacked energy to excavate it. "Why tell me now?" "Because you were hurt protecting your home while I maintained a lie, and that stopped being acceptable." He moved closer, slowly, telegraphing intention. "Let me see your wrists." Wren extended her arms with hesitation, and Jonah examined the silver burns with fury that required careful management. The wounds were already infected, red streaks radiating from contact points, because silver poisoning was cumulative for wolves, and Omegas healed slower than higher ranks. Their recovery depended on factors like nutrition and rest that Wren's life systematically denied her. "This will hurt," he warned, and reached for power that wasn't intelligence network skill, but alpha healing magic.
basic application that any strong alpha could manage, nothing that would necessarily indicate royal rank. He placed his hands over her burns, channeled warmth and accelerated regeneration, felt the infection retreat and tissue begin repairing at enhanced speed. The magic required physical contact and concentration, and Jonah was acutely aware of Ren's pulse under his fingers, the way she held herself rigid, like contact might shatter her, the small sound she made when pain receded and relief replaced it. When he released her, the burns had faded to pink marks that would disappear within days rather than festering for weeks. "Thank you," she said softly, cradling her wrists. They stood in the small cottage's center, close enough that Jonah could smell sage and copper beneath the fierce sweat from Rillier, and words arranged themselves in his throat. Apologies and explanations that felt simultaneously essential and inadequate. Before he could speak them, Ren stepped back, rebuilding distance. "Help me destroy Victor," she said, voice steady despite everything. "Use your intelligence network, your alpha abilities, whatever resources you actually have access to. Help me stop him from turning every Omega into property. Then leave, file your report to your king, and let me return to pretending I have control over anything." The bitterness in her final words cut precisely because it was earned, and Jonah nodded acceptance even as he recognized the impossibility she described. Victor's corruption was not an isolated incident, but symptom of systemic failure, and destroying one beta would not repair structure that enabled his cruelty. But telling Ren that kings saw larger patterns while individuals suffered felt like violence, so instead he said, "I'll help." They spent the remaining night hours planning, and Jonah taught her things he should not know. Details about packhouse security and council procedures and enforcement division schedules that existed in documents only the Alpha King reviewed.
Each piece of knowledge he shared deepened her suspicion that his cover story remained incomplete, but she accepted the information with pragmatism that prioritized utility over truth. Dawn arrived with message from Finn, delivered through encrypted channel while Ren prepared their breakfast with movements that remained stiff from injuries. Jonah read the report with mounting dread, then read it again, hoping his first interpretation had been paranoia rather than pattern recognition. Finn had successfully acquired evidence through his contact, an Omedafi now named Petra who cleaned administrative offices and whom pack leadership ignored with the thorough invisibility reserved for domestic workers. She had photographed documents from Victor's personal files, and the contents detailed conspiracy that extended far beyond embezzlement or power consolidation. Victor had orchestrated Jonah's parents' assassination 12 years ago, coordinating with beta-ranked wolves across 4 other territories in exchange for promises of expanded authority once he claimed the throne. The plan had failed only because Jonah had been off territory during the attack, survival through accident scheduling rather than any security measure. Now Victor was implementing Phase 2, capitalizing on Jonah's staged disappearance to position himself as interim leader while systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge his eventual claim. The Omega registration program served dual purpose, removing potential witnesses who cleaned offices and served meals, and existed invisible in spaces where conspirators spoke freely, while simultaneously creating a slave labor class that would normalize authoritarian control. The evidence included names, dates, financial transfers, and perhaps most damningly, communication logs showing Victor had been tracking Jonah's actual investigation, knew about the intelligence network, and had been feeding false information designed to send Jonah's attention toward fabricated threats in border regions, while the real conspiracy operated at Pack Center. But there was more. Notation about a blood moon ritual scheduled in 4 days, ceremony that Victor planned to use for dual purpose, public execution of dissenters to demonstrate authority, and forbidden magic working that would allow him to claim false bond to Pack lands, creating artificial connection that might survive Jonah's return and challenge. Jonah read this final detail with something close to despair, because blood moon rituals accessed ancient magic that predated modern pack structures, and if Victor successfully completed the working, removing him would require killing him, which would destabilize all 5 territories and potentially trigger the inter-pack war that Jonah's entire reign had been devoted to preventing. "What is it?" Ren asked, watching his expression. He showed her the report, watched her face pale as she processed information that transformed her personal persecution into small component of larger atrocity. When she reached the section about blood moon executions, her hands began shaking. "Nell," she whispered. "He arrested Nell last night. I got a message an hour ago while you were sleeping. She's being held as co-conspirator for harboring you." The pieces aligned with terrible logic. Victor was accelerating timeline because Jonah's 3-week deadline had passed without contact, which meant the beta had to commit fully to a coup before the Alpha King potentially returned. Nell's arrest served as both removal of witness to Jonah's location and bait to draw out anyone who might oppose the new regime. Test of loyalty disguised as justice. "We have 4 days, Jonah said, mind already calculating approaches and probabilities. We need to extract Nell before the ritual, expose Victor's conspiracy to the pack, and prevent the blood moon working. You're talking about assaulting Pack House and challenging the acting Alpha directly," Ren said. "That's suicide for an Omega, an intelligence operative, even if he is secretly Alpha rank." She was correct. Tactically sound assessment. assessment that would have earned approval in any strategic planning session, and Jonah recognized the decision point he had been approaching since finding Wren in the rain 2 weeks ago. He could maintain his cover, continue gathering evidence, wait for optimal moment to reveal himself and leverage full authority, or he could act now with incomplete information and risk everything to prevent 4 days of additional suffering. Kings made calculated choices, sacrificed individuals for collective benefit, played long games that accepted short-term casualties. But Jonah had spent 2 weeks learning that people reduced to strategic variables retained their humanity regardless of how commanders classified them, and Nell was not acceptable loss. She was person who had raised an orphan and defended her land and deserved protection he had failed to provide. "We're going tonight," he said. "Finn will provide intelligence and access. You and I will infiltrate during the Victor celebration Victor is hosting, extract Nell and any other prisoners, and if we're discovered, I'll reveal enough authority to end this." "Reveal what authority?" Wren asked, suspicion sharpening her voice. "What exactly can an intelligence operative do that would stop a beta backed by Enforcement Division?" Jonah met her eyes and made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into space that might contain ground or might contain nothing. "More than you know. Trust me for 4 more days, help me save Nell, and afterward I'll answer every question truthfully." She studied him for a long moment, intelligence and distrust and desperate hope warring across her features, and finally nodded. 4 days. Then I want complete truth, not strategic version designed for my limited clearance." "Agreed," Jonah said, knowing that in 4 days either Victor would be exposed and Jonah's identity revealed, or they would both be dead and truth would become irrelevant. They spent the day preparing, and as evening approached, as they armed themselves with silver blades and desperate courage, Jonah reached out through his still-suppressed bond to the packlands he had inherited at 19 and sworn to protect, and he promised the territory and the wolves who lived on it that this time, he would not fail them by choosing strategic patience over immediate justice. Outside, the sun set on the 4th day before Blood Moon, and in Packhouse dungeons, Nell waited in darkness while Victor Talridge prepared a celebration of his ascending power, and an Alpha King disguised as broken spy prepared to burn his careful investigation for the sake of one Omega's surrogate mother, because some calculations were more important than crowns. The Blood Moon rising. 2 days remained before the Blood Moon when Wren announced she would not wait for strategic timing, and Jonah recognized the absolutism in her voice as something beyond negotiation, the sound of person who had reached the mathematics where individual life outweighed tactical advantage. They stood in the cottage that had become war room, maps and schedules spread across the table that still bore scars from the enforcer's violence, and her green-gray eyes held certainty that felt immovable as stone. "Nell is 73 years old," Wren said, voice carrying the terrible calm of determined desperation. "She's been in Victor's custody for 2 days. Every hour we wait is another hour she's being interrogated, and I know what pack interrogation means because I heard my parents' screams before they died. I'm going tonight, with your help or without it." Jonah wanted to argue strategy, explain that premature action would alert Victor and compromise their advantage, deploy all the rational frameworks he had built over 12 years of kingship, where individual suffering was tragic but acceptable when weighed against collective stability. But he had spent 2 weeks learning the difference between acceptable in theory and acceptable in practice, and watching Wren prepare to assault Packhouse alone felt like failure more profound than any tactical miscalculation.
"We go together," he said, abandoning the careful timeline he had constructed, "but we do it intelligently. Finn has intelligence on guard rotations and structural access points. We use those advantages." Relief and determination crossed her face in equal measure, and she nodded once, sharp and military despite never having formal training. Finn arrived at dusk, carrying equipment that included communications gear and bypass keys acquired through methods Jonah chose not to examine too closely. His childhood friend looked at him with concern that went beyond operational risk. "You're compromising the entire investigation for one prisoner. That's not like you." "Perhaps I've been unlike myself for too long," Jonah replied, which was closer to philosophy than Finn's tactical observation deserved, but felt true in ways he could not fully articulate. They departed after full dark, moving through pack territory with the careful navigation of those who understood surveillance patterns and how to exploit gaps in coverage. The victory celebration Victor hosted was in full display as they approached Packhouse, light and music spilling from windows, high-ranking wolves gathering to honor their beta's ascension with enthusiasm that ranged from genuine support to fearful compliance. The spectacle served their purposes. Guards were reduced and attention directed inward toward festivity rather than outward toward security. Finn led them to service entrance, used by catering staff, bypassed the electronic lock with expertise that suggested this was not his first infiltration, and they slipped into the lower levels where dungeons had been converted from wine cellars decades ago, when pack discipline shifted from informal to institutional. The corridors smelled of damp stone and old fear, and Jonah felt rage kindle in his chest that his pack house contained spaces designed for this purpose, that his reign had allowed infrastructure of oppression to exist beneath celebration halls. They encountered First Guard at the corridor junction, young Gamma who was checking his phone with the bored inattention of someone assigned duty he considered pointless. Ren moved before Jonah could, flowing into the guard space with speed that came from desperation rather than training, and she took him down with strike to the throat that was brutal and efficient, and suggested she had been paying attention during their brief combat preparation. The guard collapsed unconscious, and Ren was already moving toward the cell block, driven by urgency that accepted no delay. The dungeon level held 8 cells, most empty but 4 contained prisoners who looked up at their approach with expressions ranging from hope to terror to exhausted indifference. Nell occupied the 3rd cell, and Jonah felt something in his chest constrict at the sight of her, the older woman who had defended Ren and her property, now reduced to a bruised shadow sitting on stone bench with the careful stillness of someone conserving strength against continued assault. "About time," Nell said, voice rough but retaining its acerbic edge. "I was beginning to think you'd wait for the execution to make your dramatic rescue." Ren made a sound between laugh and sob, and Finn worked on the cell lock while Jonah moved to assess the other prisoners, 3 Omegas who had been arrested on various pretexts that all translated to insufficient submission to Victor's new order. They watched him with the wariness of people who had learned authority meant threat, and he felt the weight of their distrust as indictment he had earned through negligence. "We're extracting all of you," Jonah said quietly. "Can you walk?" They nodded, and Finn opened Nell's cell, then moved to free the others with efficiency born from practice skill. The rescue was progressing with improbable smoothness. What should have concerned Jonah should have.
It triggered the tactical paranoia that had kept him alive through 12 years of dangerous kingship, but Ren's relief at reaching Nell alive had infected his judgment, made him want to believe success could be this straightforward. They had reached the corridor junction, prisoners gathered and moving toward exit, when Carson appeared with 11 additional enforcers, and Jonah understood with sick certainty that Victor had anticipated this exact scenario, had left deliberate gaps in security, and used Nell as bait to draw out whoever was harboring the suspicious stranger, who moved like Alpha and spoke like Commander. "Well," Carson said, smile spreading across his thick features, "the intelligence operative reveals himself. Victor will be pleased." Jonah positioned himself between the enforcers and their group, calculating odds that were catastrophic. 12 trained warriors against himself, Finn, and Ren, with 4 civilians to protect. Behind them, the exit route was compromised, and the only alternative direction led deeper into Pack House, toward the celebration where Victor held court. "Ren, take the prisoners and run," Jonah said quietly, reaching for power he had kept suppressed for 2 weeks, feeling his aura begin to stir like waking predator. "I'm not leaving you," she replied with flat certainty. That wasn't a request. He glanced back, met her eyes, and tried to convey apology for what she was about to witness, the authority he had hidden, the identity that would recontextualize every interaction they had shared. "Get them to safety. I'll handle this." Carson laughed, gestured to his enforcers to advance, and they moved with coordinated precision that spoke of training and confidence in numerical superiority. Jonah fought them with upper body strength alone initially, maintaining the fiction that his legs remained compromised, using technique and speed to compensate for positional disadvantage. He dropped 2 enforcers in the first exchange, felt silver blades score across his ribs in the second, and recognized the tactical mathematics with crystalline clarity. He could not win this fight without revealing his true capabilities, and revealing his alpha power might still be insufficient, might merely mean he died with his secrets exposed. Then Victor's voice cut through the chaos, resonant and carrying the particular satisfaction of someone whose trap had functioned exactly as designed. "Enough. I want him alive for questioning." The beta emerged from the shadows beyond Carson's group, flanked by 4 more guards, and he studied Jonah with cold blue eyes that showed recognition struggling with disbelief. Victor moved closer, examining Jonah's face with intensity that suggested he was comparing memory against present reality and finding impossible correlation. "You fight like someone I knew once," Victor said slowly, "like a king who died protecting borders while his beta managed homeland affairs." His voice dropped. "But that's coincidence, surely, because Jonah Greymark is dead in some border region, and you're merely spy who was stupid enough to let personal attachment compromise your mission." Ren made a small sound behind him, question forming, and Jonah felt the last possibilities for maintaining his deception crumble like sand. Victor didn't fully believe his own words. Suspicion was growing with each second of observation, and the moment of revelation approached whether Jonah chose it or not. "Let them go," Jonah said, indicating Ren and the prisoners. "Your quarrel is with me." "My quarrel is with anyone who opposes necessary evolution of pack structure," Victor replied. He gestured, and 2 enforcers moved toward Ren with clear intention. "The Omega will make excellent example during Blood Moon execution. Public demonstration of what happens to those who harbor traitors." The threat was a tactical error, final miscalculation in Victor's otherwise flawless conspiracy, because it transformed Jonah's strategic restraint into something simpler and more dangerous. He had tolerated surveillance and investigation and careful
documentation because kings operated within frameworks larger than personal feeling. But frameworks meant nothing against the immediate physics of Ren being dragged toward cells, against her struggle and Nell's cry of protest and the beta's smile that contained anticipation of suffering. Jonah stopped suppressing his aura. The transformation was not physical initially, merely the release of power he had compressed for 2 weeks, golden authority exploding outward like detonation, and the force of it drove every wolf in the corridor to their knees with involuntary submission. Alpha dominance was hierarchical magic, older than pack structures, coded into wolf DNA as recognition of supreme authority, and Jonah's aura carried the particular weight of Alpha King, ruler of 5 territories, apex predator who commanded not through strength alone, but through mystical connection to pack lands themselves. Carson collapsed first, followed by his enforcers, their bodies responding to biological imperative that superseded conscious choice. Finn remained standing through familiarity and preparation, and Ren stayed upright through what Jonah suspected was pure stubborn will, though she swayed and her eyes had gone wide with shock that was transforming into comprehension and betrayal. Victor alone managed partial resistance, beta rank and age allowing him to remain on one knee rather than fully prostrate, and his face cycled through expressions too rapid to catalog, before settling on fury that transcended rationality. "You," he breathed. "Jonah, you've been here the entire time." "Yes," Jonah said simply, and let his shift begin. Bones restructuring and muscles expanding, his human form flowing into the massive black wolf that was his true shape. Amber gold eyes blazing with accumulated rage from 2 weeks of witnessed injustice. His wolf stood nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, supernatural size that marked Alpha King bloodline, and his presence filled the corridor like physical pressure that made breathing difficult for those still conscious enough to attempt it. He heard Ren's sharp intake of breath, heard her whisper, "The Alpha King," with inflection that contained betrayal and understanding, and horror at the implications of every conversation they had shared, every moment of false vulnerability he had performed, while she offered genuine care. But Jonah could not address her shock, could not explain or apologize, because Victor was moving, drawing on reserves of beta strength and something else, something that smelled wrong, acrid and rotting, forbidden magic that predated modern pack law. Dark veins spread across Victor's skin like infection, and his eyes clouded with black that suggested he had been preparing for this confrontation, had consumed or channeled power that came with prices Jonah understood from historical texts and ancient warnings. Blood magic, the kind that required sacrifice and degraded its practitioners, the kind that Victor had clearly been studying longer than 2 weeks of investigation could reveal. "You should have stayed hidden," Victor said, and his voice carried harmonics that were not entirely his own anymore. "Should have remained the absent king, while I fixed what your weakness broke." Then Victor lunged, and the real battle began. Beta corrupted by forbidden magic against Alpha King who had suppressed his power too long, and between them an Omega who had shared her food with a stranger, and was now learning that kindness could not exist separate from the political calculations of those who held power over life and death. The King's justice. The corridor erupted into violence that transcended mere physical combat, became instead collision of magical authorities and competing claims to pack sovereignty. Victor's corrupted form moved with speed that should have been impossible for beta rank, blood magic compensating for hierarchical disadvantage with borrowed power that smelled of death and sacrifice. He struck at Jonah with claws extended and wreathed in black energy that burned where it connected, and Jonah felt the unnatural, natural heat sear through fur and into muscle, pain that was designed to corrupt rather than merely wound. They fought through the dungeon level and into the main corridors, their battle drawing wolves from the celebration like gravity pulling satellites into destructive orbit. Pack members emerged from the grand hall to witness their beta and a massive black wolf locked in combat that shattered furniture and cracked stone walls, and Jonah heard the gasps of recognition as wolves who had served him for years identified their missing Alpha King in the golden eyes and supernatural size of the creature destroying their second in command. Victor was strong, enhanced beyond natural capacity by whatever forbidden rituals he had performed, but Jonah carried 12 years of combat experience and the mystical connection to packlands that sang through his blood like electrical current. He drove Victor backward through superior technique and raw authority, felt his jaws close on the beta's shoulder, and tasted the corruption there, poison that had been growing in his inner circle while he focused on external threats and diplomatic protocols. But Victor was not fighting to win through conventional victory, Jonah realized too late. The beta was maneuvering towards specific location,
drawing the combat toward the grand hall where the celebration had transformed into horrified audience, and more critically, where 3 Omega servants stood frozen in terror. Victor broke from Jonah's grip with desperate strength, spun toward the nearest Omega, a young female who cleaned administrative offices, and whose name Jonah suddenly remembered was Petra, Finn's contact who had photographed evidence. The blood magic Victor channeled required fuel. Sacrifice of life force drained him those weaker in hierarchy, and he reached for Petra with hands that had gone entirely black with corruption, with intention that was unmistakable. Jonah lunged to intercept, but Victor had calculated angles perfectly, and in the split second before Jonah could close the distance, Ren appeared from the crowd and threw herself between Victor and his intended victim. Time performed strange distortions, expanded the moment into something Jonah experienced with crystalline clarity and absolute horror. Ren's small frame colliding with Petra and driving her clear, Victor's corrupted claws changing trajectory to catch Ren instead, the blood magic making contact with her exposed shoulder and beginning its terrible work. Jonah watched black veins spread from the contact point, watched Ren's face contort with pain that went beyond physical as the curse began converting her living tissue into something inert and dead, petrification that would spread slowly toward her heart and brain while she remained conscious and aware of her own transformation into statue. The rage that filled Jonah transcended anything he had previously understood as anger, became instead fundamental rejection of reality where this outcome was permitted to exist. He hit Victor with the full weight of his Alpha King form and all the accumulated fury of 2 weeks watching suffering he had failed to prevent, and his jaws found Victor's throat with predatory precision that came from instinct older than civilization. Victor struggled, tried to deploy more blood magic, but Jonah's bite had severed the connection between the beta's corrupted power and his physical form, and the black veins that had enhanced him began reversing, consuming him from within as the forbidden magic recognized it no longer had living host to anchor to. Victor's death was neither clean nor quick, but it was final, and Jonah felt no satisfaction in it, only grim necessity and mounting desperation as he turned toward where Ren had collapsed. Finn had reached her first, was cradling her against his chest while Nell pressed hands to the spreading petrification with healing magic that was insufficient against curse this powerful. The black veins had reached Ren's collarbone and were creeping steadily toward her heart, and her breathing came in shallow gasps as her lungs began
the slow process of forgetting how to function. Jonah shifted back to human form, moved to her side with urgency that felt like drowning, and examined the curse with knowledge accumulated from ancient texts and forbidden archives that Alpha Kings maintained but prayed never to need. Blood magic curses required blood magic cures, and the only power sufficient to counter beta-level corruption was Alpha King bonding magic, the permanent mate bond that would tie Ren's life force to his own and flood her system with enough golden authority to burn out the curse. But mate bonds required consent, explicit acceptance from both parties, and Ren was barely conscious, her eyes unfocused with pain and shock. Around them, the pack had gathered in silence that felt like held breath, witnesses to their beta's death and their Alpha King's return, and now this moment that would define what kind of ruler Jonah actually was, beneath the strategic calculations and political necessity. "Ren," he said urgently, taking her face between his hands, willing her to focus on his voice. "The curse is blood magic. I can counter it with Alpha King bond, but it requires your consent and creates permanent mate connection. Do you understand?" Her eyes cleared slightly, intelligence swimming up through the pain, and she looked at him with expression that contained betrayal and confusion and desperate desire to live. "You lied," she whispered, "about everything." "About my identity," Jonah agreed, throat tight with emotions he had no time to process. "Not about caring what happened to you. Let me save you, and afterward you can hate me with all the justified fury you possess, but let me save you first." Ren's breathing hitched, the petrification reaching her sternum, and Jonah saw the moment she made her decision, saw resignation or acceptance or simply survival instinct override everything else. She managed the smallest nod, and Jonah did not wait for more explicit permission, could not afford to, because seconds mattered and she was dying while he sought reassurance. The bonding ritual was ancient and required no ceremony, merely intention and exchange of blood and the complete opening of his power to flood into her system. Jonah bit his own wrist, pressed the bleeding wound to her mouth, and released every suppression he had maintained for 2 weeks, let his Alpha King authority pour into her in golden torrent that made her body convulse with the force of it. Mate bonds were mystical connections that operated beyond physical law, created permanent psychic link between partners that allowed sharing of strength, sensation, and emotion. Jonah felt the bond snap into place with intensity that drove the air from his lungs, felt Ren's pain become his pain, and his power become her power, and the curse that had been killing her met the overwhelming force of Alpha King magic channeled through new bond and began to retreat. The petrification reversed with agonizing slowness, black veins fading to gray and then to pink and finally to healthy skin, and Ren's breathing deepened as her lungs remembered their function. But the process was torture. Jonah felt it through the bond, felt how the competing magics burned through her system like acid, and he held her through the worst of it, while the pack watched the king claim an Omega mate in defiance of every traditional expectation and political calculation. When the curse finally broke completely, when Ren's body went limp with exhaustion rather than death, Jonah became aware of the silence surrounding them, the weight of hundreds of eyes witnessing what had just occurred. He looked up to find his pack arrayed in a rough circle, expressions ranging from shock to disapproval to calculating assessment of what this development meant for hierarchy and succession. Finn spoke first, his voice carrying forced lightness that did not quite mask concern. "Well, that's one way to announce your return and secure your bloodline simultaneously." But others were less diplomatic. An alpha from the Western Territory, broad-shouldered male named Garrick.
Garrett, whose daughter had been informally discussed as potential mate match, stepped forward with face tight with anger. "You bonded an Omega, the lowest rank. That makes her queen, gives her authority over alphas who have served this pack for generations?" "Yes," Jonah said simply, making no apology and offering no justification beyond the single word. "The council will never accept this," Garrett continued, and murmurs of agreement rippled through assembled wolves. "Pack law allows challenge to Alpha King's mate selection when it threatens stability. I invoke formal challenge." 4 other wolves stepped forward then, joining Garrett in traditional configuration of challenge party, and Jonah recognized this was not spontaneous protest, but coordinated political maneuver. These were wolves who had been loyal to Victor, or who saw opportunity in chaos, and they were using ancient law to force confrontation that would either remove Ren or weaken Jonah's authority through public combat. "Challenge accepted," Jonah said, because refusing would constitute greater weakness than fighting. "When?" 2 days, Garrett replied. "At dawn, full pack assembly as witnesses. Traditional rules, you and your mate against 5 challengers, first to yield loses position." It was aggressive timeline designed to prevent Ren's recovery, but Jonah had no leverage to negotiate better terms, and he nodded acceptance while calculating odds that were catastrophic. Ren was barely conscious, would need days to adjust to the mate bond and the trace of alpha power it had given her, and he would be fighting while protecting partner who could barely stand. The crowd dispersed slowly, some wolves approaching to offer cautious welcome home to their alpha king, others leaving with expressions that promised future resistance. Finn helped Jonah carry Ren to the royal quarters that he had not occupied for 2 weeks, and Nell followed with a bag of medical supplies, and the kind of determined concern that suggested she would not be easily dismissed. They settled Ren in the enormous bed that suddenly felt absurd in its scale, and Jonah sat beside her while Finn secured the room, and Nell prepared tea with hands that shook slightly from her own recent captivity. Through the new bond, Jonah felt Ren's consciousness stirring, felt her awareness of him as constant presence at the edge of her perception, and he wondered what it felt like from her perspective to suddenly have permanent connection to someone who had systematically deceived her. When her eyes opened, they had changed, flecked now with gold that marked the mate bond's influence, and she looked at him with expression he could not fully read through the overwhelming rush of her emotions bleeding through their connection. Fear and anger and exhaustion, and something that might have been relief or might have been despair. "How long until I can walk?" she asked, voice rough but steady. "Ren, you nearly died. You need rest." "How long until I can walk?" she repeated, with steel underneath the exhaustion. "Because apparently I have 2 days to learn how to fight beside an alpha king, and I'd prefer not to be deadweight during the challenge that will determine whether I'm executed as inappropriate mate choice." Jonah felt something in his chest crack at her pragmatism, at the way she had already moved past shock to tactical assessment, and he looked at this Omega who had shared her inadequate soup with a stranger, and was now facing combat trial because he had chosen to save her life. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing it was insufficient, "for all of it." Ren held his gaze for a long moment, and through the bond he felt her working through emotions too complex for simple categorization. 2 days, she finally said. "You have 2 days to teach me how not to get us both killed. After that, if we survive, you're going to answer every question I ask with complete honesty, and I'm going to decide whether being bonded to you is fate or punishment." It was more grace than he deserved, and Jonah nodded acceptance of terms that felt like mercy.
And judgment in equal measure. Outside the royal quarters, the pack was processing their beta's death and their alpha king's return, and the impossible reality of an Omega queen. And in 2 days they would gather to witness whether love or tradition or simple violence would determine what came next. the bond forged in breaking. The 2 weeks that followed Victor's death and Ren's bonding existed in temporal space that felt simultaneously compressed and elongated, hours stretching into significance, while days disappeared into preparation that consumed every waking moment. Jonah had requested extended timeline for the challenge from Pack Council, citing Ren's need to recover from curse trauma and adjust to mate bond, and after lengthy deliberation they had granted 14 days rather than 2, though several council members made clear this was mercy they expected repaid with political concessions. Ren spent the first 3 days mostly unconscious, her body processing the fundamental restructuring that came from bonding to Alpha King, her Omega physiology attempting to accommodate the trace of golden authority that now ran through her veins like secondary bloodstream. Jonah remained with her through the worst of it, felt through their connection every moment of pain and confusion as her wolf adjusted to new reality. And he learned that mate bonds were not romantic abstraction, but invasive intimacy that permitted no privacy, no retreat into isolated self. He felt her dreams, fragmented memories of childhood before her parents died, the moment she found their bodies, the long years of systematic dismissal that had taught her to make herself invisible. He felt her anger at his deception, rage that was complicated by understanding that he had genuinely helped her even while lying about who he was. And he felt her fear, bone-deep terror that she would fail during the channeling and cause his death or disgrace, that her inadequacy would prove every wolf who opposed their bond correct. On the 4th day, Ren woke with clarity that had been absent before, and her first words were pragmatic demand rather than emotional processing. "Teach me to fight properly. No more basic self-defense. I need real combat training." They converted a private training room in the royal quarters into war preparation space, and Jonah taught her everything he could compress into inadequate timeline. She was naturally quick and had good instincts, but she lacked the ingrained muscle memory that came from years of practice, and her Omega physiology meant she would never possess the raw strength of Alpha opponents. So Jonah focused on teaching her to fight intelligently rather than powerfully, how to use opponents' momentum against them, how to identify weaknesses in stance and exploit them, how to survive rather than dominate. Nell attended many of these sessions, sitting in a corner of the training room with tea and acerbic commentary that somehow helped more than hindered. On the 6th day, while Ren practiced falling and rolling to minimize injury, the older woman spoke with the careful precision of someone delivering difficult truth. "You're teaching her Alpha combat techniques," Nell observed, "but she's not Alpha and never will be, bond or no bond. Omega strength is endurance, not explosive power. We outlast rather than overpower." Jonah paused mid-demonstration, recognized the wisdom in her words even as they indicted his approach. "What would you teach her? How to make them exhaust themselves trying to catch her. How to take hits that look devastating but avoid critical damage. How to make her survival feel like their failure." Nell smiled with unhumor. "Omegas have been surviving in world designed to break us for centuries. We know things about persistence that Alphas never learn because they've never had to." From that point, Nell became secondary instructor, and the training shifted focus towards strategies that worked with Ren's natural capabilities rather than against them. They practiced defensive techniques that prioritized survival over victory, taught her how to
read combat flow and position herself where she would be least vulnerable, how to make small contributions that supported Jonah's fighting rather than attempting to match the challengers directly. The mate bond complicated and enhanced everything. Jonah felt Ren's exhaustion as his own, which meant he could gauge exactly how far to push before rest became necessary. But he also felt her frustration and self-doubt, the constant internal narrative that insisted she was inadequate, that she would fail him, that bonding her had been a strategic error that would cost him his throne. On the 8th night, after a particularly brutal training session that had left them both bloody and depleted, Ren finally voiced the question that had been building since she regained consciousness. They sat in the royal quarters sitting room, Jonah tending to split knuckles on her hands while she stared at the fire with expression that suggested she was gathering courage. "Why did you really come to Pack Outskirts?" she asked quietly. The complete truth this time, not intelligence operative cover story. Jonah had known this conversation approached with inevitability, had prepared answers during the long hours of her unconsciousness, but preparation felt insufficient against the directness of her gaze. "I suspected Victor of conspiracy and wanted to observe how Pack members behaved when they believed no authority was watching. I thought I would discover who was corrupt and who was loyal." "And did you?" Something sharp underneath her mild tone. "I discovered I was asking wrong questions," Jonah admitted. "I was looking for individual traitors when the real problem was systemic failure.
I had been so focused on preventing external threats that I didn't notice internal rot, didn't see how my absence enabled cruelty, didn't understand that loyal subordinates could still cause tremendous harm if the structure they operated within was broken. Ren absorbed this, and through the bond he felt her processing not just his words but the emotions underneath them, the genuine regret and growing understanding that she could perceive directly through their connection. "You tested us," she said. "All of us on Pack Edges. We were your experiment to see if we deserved better treatment, or if we were thriving within our proper place in hierarchy." The accusation landed with precision, because it was accurate, and Jonah did not insult her by denying it. "Yes, and you showed me I had built my reign on comfortable assumptions that dissolved under actual observation. Is that why you bonded me?" The question emerged flat, carefully emptied of inflection. Guilt transformed into grand gesture? "No." Jonah met her eyes directly. "I bonded you because watching you die was intolerable, and I had power to prevent it. Everything else, the political implications and hierarchy disruption and strategic complications, all of that was irrelevant against the immediate fact of your death being unacceptable." Through the bond, he felt her skepticism war with desire to believe him, felt the way trust had become complicated territory for someone whose kindness had been systematically punished. She looked away first, returned her attention to the fire, and spoke with voice that carried exhaustion beyond physical depletion. "I don't know how to be queen. I don't know pack politics or diplomatic protocol, or how to navigate authority structures I've spent my entire life avoiding. In 6 days, I'm going to fight beside you against 5 wolves who want me dead, and I'm terrified I'll be the reason you lose everything." Jonah took her injured hands carefully, felt the bond pulse with shared sensation. "You've survived impossible circumstances with grace, and maintained your humanity in an environment designed to destroy it. Those capabilities matter more than protocol knowledge. And regarding the challenge," he paused, chose words with care, "you won't be the reason we lose. If we fail, it will be because I've spent 12 years being the kind of king who needs public combat trial to prove his mate choice is valid."
Ren's mouth twitched with something that might have been smile attempting to form. "That's either very wise or very stupid, and I'm too tired to determine which." The remaining days passed with relentless momentum, and Jonah watched Ren transform from exhausted Omega into something harder to categorize. She would never be traditional Alpha Queen, would never possess the commanding presence that pack members expected from royalty, but she developed a quality of focused determination that commanded respect through different mechanism. Wolves who observed her training began to reconsider their assumptions, seeing not weak Omega elevated beyond her capacity, but someone who approached impossible challenge with pragmatism and courage that transcended rank. The night before the challenge, Nell came to their quarters with tea and expression that suggested this was farewell conversation in case morning brought disaster. She sat with them in comfortable silence for long minutes, then spoke with careful gentleness. "I told Ren once about my mate," Nell said, looking at neither of them directly. "He died young, before we could complete our bond. I refused him initially because he was Gamma and I believed accepting would limit my independence. I spent 50 years regretting that pride." She finally met Ren's eyes. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you chose to live and to fight. That's more courage than I managed." After Nell departed, Ren and Jonah lay together in the enormous royal bed, not sleeping but not quite waking, existing in a liminal space where the bond made their thoughts and fears blend into shared experience. Through the connection, Jonah felt Ren's terror and determination in equal measure, felt her rehearsing combat sequences and calculating probabilities, and wondering if she would survive to see another sunset. He pulled her closer, careful of her still healing injuries, and spoke into her copper hair. "Whatever the outcome tomorrow, you should know that meeting you rearranged my understanding of what kingship should mean. You made me better by refusing to accept my comfortable distance from consequences." Ren was quiet long enough that he thought she might have fallen asleep. Then her voice emerged, soft but clear. "If we survive this, you're going to be insufferable king who actually cares about Omega welfare and disrupts centuries of hierarchy. I'm not sure that's improvement." "Despite everything," Jonah smiled. "Probably not, but it's more honest than what I was building before." Dawn approached with inexorable patience, and somewhere in Packlands, 5 challengers were preparing for combat that would determine whether tradition or transformation would define their future. Jonah held his mate and felt through their bond her steady heartbeat, and he thought that perhaps this,
This connection and shared vulnerability and mutual understanding was what he had actually been testing for during his 2 weeks of disguise, even if he had not possessed the wisdom to recognize it. The blood moon had passed with Victor's planned ritual, but its symbolic weight remained, and morning would bring different kind of trial, one where Alpha King and Omega Queen would fight together against those who believed hierarchy should remain unchanged, who thought power should flow downward rather than circulate, who could not imagine that strength might look like small woman who shared inadequate soup with strangers and survived systematic cruelty without losing her capacity for kindness. Outside, stars faded toward dawn, and the pack began gathering to witness judgment rendered through violence, which was ancient tradition but perhaps not inevitable future, and everything depended on whether two people connected by desperate bond could convince hundreds that love and strategic necessity were not mutually exclusive, that choosing to value individual life over political calculation was not weakness but different kind of strength. The Omega Queen. Dawn arrived with the particular clarity that preceded significant violence, the sky bleeding from black to purple to gold.
While the pack assembled in the natural amphitheater that had witnessed challenges and judgments for generations before Jonah's grandfather had formalized their territories into kingdom. The space was carved from living stone on Packland's eastern edge, circular depression surrounded by rising tiers where hundreds could observe combat below, and every available position was occupied by wolves who had come to witness their Alpha King defend his unprecedented mate choice. Jonah stood in the challenger's preparation area with Ren beside him, both wearing ceremonial armor that was more symbolic than protective. Leather and metal worked with pack insignia that marked them as official combatants rather than simple fighters. Through the bond, he felt Ren's fear, a steady pulse beneath her surface calm, felt her running through combat sequences Nell had drilled into her, felt her absolute certainty that she would be the weak point their opponents exploited. Across the amphitheater, the 5 challengers prepared with confidence that came from numerical advantage and traditional expectation. Garrett commanded the group, the broad-shouldered alpha from Western Territory whose daughter had been discussed as potential royal match. And beside him stood Mallory, a beta female known for speed and precision strikes. The remaining 3 were Taylor, an alpha male from the southern region who believed deeply in hierarchy maintenance, and 2 gammas named Marcus and Sven who had been loyal to Victor and saw this challenge as revenge for their patron's death disguised as principal. The Pack Council elder, a silver-haired woman named Iris who had served through 3 generations of Greymark leadership, descended to the amphitheater floor and spoke with voice magically amplified to reach all assembled witnesses. Challenge has been issued and accepted under traditional law. Jonah Greymark, Alpha King, and his mate Ren Coulter will face 5 challengers in ritual combat. Rules are ancient and absolute. Fight continues until one side yields or is incapacitated. Killing is prohibited, but injury is expected. Victory determines validity of mate bond and Queen's right to position. Iris withdrew to the edge, and silence fell across hundreds of assembled wolves, anticipation so thick it felt physical. Jonah looked at Ren, found her green-gray eyes steady despite the fear he felt through their connection, and he reached for her hand briefly, squeezed once, then released as they moved to starting positions. The combat began with Garrett's charge, direct assault meant to test Jonah's defense while his alpha power was divided protecting Ren. Jonah met the challenge head-on, shifted partially to access enhanced strength while maintaining enough human form for tactical fighting, and their collision sent shockwaves through the amphitheater floor. They exchanged blows with brutal efficiency, Garrett's experience evident in his technique, but Jonah fought with desperation that transcended mere skill. While they engaged, Mallory and Taylor circled toward Ren with coordinated movement that suggested pre-planned strategy. They would eliminate the perceived weak link, force Jonah to choose between maintaining his own defense and protecting his mate, create tactical dilemma that would exploit the bond's emotional connection. But Ren did not fight like they expected. She had internalized Nell's teaching about Omega endurance, and rather than meeting their attacks directly, she moved with fluid evasion that made them chase her in increasingly frustrated patterns. She led them in circular path that kept Jonah's position within her peripheral vision, used the amphitheater's natural terrain to create obstacles, made herself difficult target while avoiding the stand-up confrontation that would end quickly in her defeat. Marcus and Sven attempted to support their companions by pressuring Jonah simultaneously with Garrett, and for several brutal minutes Jonah fought 3 opponents while tracking Ren's position through combat awareness and bond sense. He took hits he could have avoided, accepted damage to maintain positioning that prevented the challengers from surrounding him completely, and felt his ribs crack under particularly vicious strike from Marcus.
Through the bond, Ren felt his pain as her own, and Jonah felt her moment of decision, the instant she stopped purely evading and shifted to active engagement. She targeted Marcus deliberately, the Gamma who had just injured Jonah, and she attacked not with power but with technique Nell had taught her, a strike to the knee that hyperextended his joint, followed by a calculated fall that made him stumble over her seemingly collapsed form, then roll that brought her clear while he struggled to recover balance. The maneuver was not devastating, but it was effective, and more importantly, it demonstrated intelligence over strength, Omega capabilities deployed strategically rather than attempting to mimic Alpha combat style. Ripple of surprise moved through the watching pack, wolves who had expected Ren to be liability, discovering she was at minimum competent, at maximum genuinely tactical asset. The battle continued with grinding intensity, minutes stretching into a quarter hour while both sides absorbed damage and fatigue accumulated. Jonah fought with precision born from 12 years of kingship that had required periodic combat to maintain authority, but he was also protecting Ren through positioning and distraction, dividing his attention in ways that created openings his opponents exploited. Taylor caught him with silver blade across the ribs, metal that burned wolf flesh and inhibited healing, and Jonah felt the wound through doubled perspective, his own pain and Ren's sympathetic agony transmitted through bond. The injury slowed him fractionally, and Garrett pressed the advantage with combination strikes that drove Jonah backward toward the amphitheater wall. Ren saw his danger, felt it through connection that made his crisis her crisis, and she made a choice that was either tactically brilliant or fatally stupid. She deliberately positioned herself in Mallory's attack path, took the beta strike on her left leg rather than evading, felt bone crack under the impact, and used her fall to create opening that allowed Jonah to disengage from Garrett's pressure. The sacrifice was calculated. Ren had studied their opponents during 2 weeks of preparation and identified Mallory as the challenger most likely to hesitate after injuring someone smaller and clearly disadvantaged. The beta did indeed pause, expression flickering with doubt as Ren collapsed with obviously broken leg, and in that moment of hesitation Jonah struck Garrett with accumulated fury and desperation that transcended technique. He drove the Alpha back with a sequence of strikes that were more controlled violence than formal combat, and Garrett's confident expression finally cracked into something resembling concern. Around them, Marcus was recovering from Ren's earlier maneuver, but moving slower from his damaged knee, and Taylor and Sven showed visible fatigue from sustained high-intensity fighting. Ren pulled herself upright on her broken leg through sheer determination and pain tolerance that Jonah felt through the bond like sympathetic fire in his own limb. She could not put weight on it, could barely stand, but remained in fighting stance and spoke with voice that carried across the amphitheater through projection technique Nell had taught her. "I yield nothing," she said clearly, "and I am not your enemy. Your actual enemy died 2 weeks ago in Packhouse Corridor, and what you're fighting now is the idea that hierarchy must remain unchanged or everything collapses." The words were not part of traditional combat, technically could be considered a distraction tactic, but they landed with weight that made several challengers pause. Mallory fully disengaged, stepped back with expression that suggested internal conflict had reached a conclusion. "I yield," the beta said formally. "I challenge to defend tradition, but tradition that requires this feels more like cruelty than preservation." Her withdrawal led
4 opponents, and Garrett's face flushed with anger at the defection. "You swore oath to see this through," he snapped. "I swore to defend pack integrity," Mallory corrected, "and I'm not convinced this challenge serves that purpose anymore." Taylor and the 2 Gammas exchanged glances, visible uncertainty spreading like infection. They had expected easy victory against weak Omega and distracted Alpha King, had anticipated Ren would fold quickly and leave Jonah fighting alone and emotionally compromised. Instead, they faced opponents who fought with synchronized desperation and tactical intelligence, and more critically, who were winning crowd sympathy through visible suffering and refusal to yield. Jonah pressed his advantage against Garrett while the other challengers hesitated, drove the Western Alpha backward through combination of technique and raw power, until Garrett stumbled over uneven ground and fell heavily. Jonah followed him down, pinned him with alpha dominance and physical weight, and spoke quietly enough that only Garrett could hear. "You can yield with honor intact, or I can continue until you're unconscious and the outcome is unchanged except for additional suffering. Choose wisely." Garrett struggled for a moment, pride warring with pragmatism. Then his body went limp in universal signal of submission. "I yield," he said, voice tight with humiliation and respect in equal measure. 2 down, 3 remaining, and the odds had shifted from catastrophic to merely terrible. But Jonah was bleeding from multiple wounds, and Ren could barely stand, and Taylor with Marcus and Sven were regrouping for coordinated assault that would likely end the combat decisively. Then a voice spoke from the watching crowd, young and uncertain but carrying enough volume to be heard. "I challenge the challengers." Heads turned toward the speaker, and Jonah recognized the young Gamma who had been first guard they encountered during Nell's rescue, the one Ren had taken down with a strike to throat. He descended to the amphitheater floor with determination that outweighed his obvious nervousness. "Combat law allows interruption if new challenger believes original challenge is unjust," he said, directing his words to Iris rather than the fighters. "I'm invoking that right. The Queen offered me position in her guard after defeating me.
showed mercy when she could have pressed advantage. That's not weakness requiring challenge. That's strength deserving support. Iris looked startled. Clearly this was obscure protocol rarely invoked, but she consulted briefly with other council members before nodding. Challenge to challengers is valid under ancient law. State your name and commitment. Tobias Wren, the young Gamma said, and Jonah noticed Wren's sharp intake of breath at the shared surname. Some connection there he would need to explore later. And I stand with my queen. Taylor looked furious at this development, but Marcus and Sven appeared rattled by the crowd's murmur of approval at Tobias's declaration. Momentum was shifting, visible in body language and energy, and when Jonah pulled himself upright with Wren leaning against him for support, they no longer looked like defeated party awaiting final blow, but like survivors who had earned their position through blood and stubbornness. We can continue, Jonah said, addressing the remaining challengers directly. Fight until someone is permanently damaged, and victory is rendered meaningless through cost. Or you can yield and we can begin the actual work of repairing what Victor broke and building something better. Sven yielded first, then Marcus, both making formal submission gestures that acknowledged defeat without excessive humiliation. Taylor stood alone, clearly torn between principles and pragmatism, and finally he spoke with stiff formality that suggested this hurt his pride more than any physical blow. I yield the challenge, but not the concern that prompted it. You've won the right to keep your mate, but you haven't yet proven she can function as queen. That judgment requires time and observation.
Tension. It was qualified surrender, and Jonah accepted it as best available outcome. Iris declared the challenge concluded, judgment in favor of the Alpha King and his mate, and the assembled pack erupted into noise that mixed approval and concern and confusion in equal measure. Healers descended to treat injuries, and Jonah felt his consciousness waver as adrenaline faded and blood loss asserted its reality. Through the bond, he felt Wren's matching exhaustion and her broken legs screaming pain, and they held each other upright through mutual support that was metaphorical and literal simultaneously. The weeks that followed existed in a blur of healing and political reconstruction and learning to navigate mate bond's constant intimacy. Wren's first decree as queen was abolition of Omega registration program and establishment of council seat for Omega representation, changes that were radical but necessary, and that she implemented with a combination of Nell's advice and her own hard-won understanding of how systems perpetuated cruelty through bureaucratic distance. 3 months after the challenge, they returned to Wren's original cottage on Nell's property, kept as private retreat from palace formality. They cooked dinner together in the small kitchen where Jonah had first tasted soup stretched thin by generosity, and he watched his mate move through domestic space with confidence that had been built through survival and was now reinforced by authority she had not sought but was learning to wield effectively. Victor's co-conspirators in other territories have been arrested, Jonah reported, sharing intelligence that had arrived that afternoon. The conspiracy is fully dismantled. Good, Wren said, stirring vegetables that came from Nell's greenhouse. Now we can focus on preventing the conditions that made conspiracy possible in first place. Through the bond, Jonah felt her determination and exhaustion in equal measure, felt the weight of responsibility she carried despite never having prepared for leadership role. He moved behind her, wrapped arms carefully around her waist, rested his chin on her shoulder. I came to pack edges pretending to be broken so I could test everyone else, he said quietly. And you showed me I was actually broken, just in ways I hadn't recognized. Thank you for that gift, even though receiving it was painful. Wren turned in his embrace, green-gray eyes now permanently flecked with gold studying his face with the directness he had learned meant she was about to say something important. Then we'll figure out how to be whole together. Not perfect, not matching some ideal of what Alpha King and Omega Queen should be, just whole enough to do the work that needs doing. They ate dinner in the cottage that had witnessed the beginning of everything, surrounded by simplicity that contrasted sharply with palace luxury, and Jonah thought that perhaps this was what kingship should have always meant. Not distance and strategic calculation, but connection, and understanding that individual suffering mattered as much as collective stability, that power's purpose was protection rather than dominance, that sometimes the person who shared inadequate soup with stranger understood leadership better than the one who sat on throne and called it wisdom. Outside, the packlands settled into evening, and somewhere Omega voices were being heard in council sessions, and hierarchy was beginning its slow transformation towards something that valued endurance as much as explosive strength, and an Alpha King learned daily from his Omega Queen that true power came not from commanding submission, but from earning trust through consistent demonstration that authority could be wielded with mercy. The cottage light glowed warm against gathering darkness, beacon visible from Nell's farmhouse where the older woman watched with satisfaction, and from pack territories where wolves were learning that change, while difficult, was not synonymous with collapse,
and that sometimes the most radical act was simply refusing to accept that cruelty was an inevitable component of strength.